89.3 and 88.5 Yes FM. Online at www.yeshome.com. Now on the free Yes FM iTunes app and the Yes FM Android app, or the free TuneIn Radio app. Search Yes FM Lima.
We are joined by Glenn Pemberton. He is a professor of Old Testament at Abilene Christian University and has written a new book called After Lament, Psalms for Learning to Trust Again. Glenn, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's good to have you in with us. I remember when I was in seminary, one of my favorite classes was our class on the Psalms, because the Psalm, anything in your life that you're going on, good, bad, or indifferent, you can probably find in the Psalms. And what I loved about them is not only would you find that, but you would find ways to express that to God, and the idea that it's real, so practical, and it tells you not only, yes, other people are feeling this way, but you can express this to God as well. It gives us kind of a language to speak to God. Do you see that
Absolutely.
as the power of the Psalms?
Oh, yeah, that's absolutely the power of the Psalms. And it's not just that you can find a psalm that you can just read if that happens to be your psalm, but it is that the Psalms can teach you a language. It can teach you how to praise God. It can teach you how to lament or cry out to God. It can teach you all of these different languages that we all need. From time to time, the human life is just that complex that we all need these languages. And so you're right. The Psalms teach us all of these wonderful languages, yes, that we need in order to stay in relationship with God.
And I was mentioning to you earlier, while we were chatting off the air, earlier this week we talked to someone and did a book, and their book was on using the Psalms when you're in the time of lament, when you're in that time of crisis,
Yes.
and when you're in that time of brokenness, using the Psalms to help you in that time. Your book, kind of a perfect bookend to that, because yours is about after that time. How do we reestablish that relationship to God? What was the impetus for writing this book? Why that particular focus?
Well, it's exactly what you were just talking about with the earlier discussion. I wrote an earlier book that was entitled Hurting with God, and that was learning to lament with the Psalms. And that was coming out of a time of pain in my life, and I struggle with physical pain. I have a chronic condition, neurological condition that leaves me dealing with pain every day. And so I wrote the earlier book in order to help myself learn the language of lament and be able to talk to God when I was in the pain. And I'm still in the pain, but like Paul said, he prayed to God, and after a while, 3 times for the thorn to be removed, and God said no. Well, sometimes it's time to move on after lament, even when God has said no, and especially maybe when God has said no. And so you may come into lament, and you may leave lament going in a number of different directions, including, praise and thanksgiving for what God has done. And we love to hear those stories about what God has done, but also learning how to live and have a faith life with a God who, if you can say it, has disappointed you.
Yeah.
And that's sort of where the book heads, is all of those different directions that the Psalms take us.
I think one of the stories in the Bible that comes to mind, I think of David, and after he's caught in his sin with Bathsheba, and he's, cries out to God, and God says, I'm going to take your child, and he's weeping and lamenting before the Lord, in hopes of saving the child. The child dies, and then they come in and tell him. Everybody's scared to tell him because they think he's going to kill himself. He's been so distraught, and he stops weeping, and he says, well, what's done is done. I hope that maybe the Lord would have mercy, but now, it's over, and God has done what he's done. And I think of that as one of those times, because David, of course, he put everything in the Psalms. And, I think of that one of those times where here's one example of someone coming out of that lament, maybe a little disappointed with God, maybe a little disappointed with himself.
Right. But knowing that it is time to move on.
Yeah.
And, in his case, it's pretty easy to know, okay, it's over.
Yeah.
I need to stop the lament, and I need to begin to move on. And sometimes it's not so easy to tell when it's time to move on. And it may take some good spiritual discernment, not only by yourself, but by people around you who are full of the Spirit and full of faith, to help you know when it is time to say, okay, it's time to move on in life. And now, that's not to say that we still don't lament from time to time. I tell you, when I have bad days, the lament is still there, still available to me. But learning how to live in trust, and that's the key. We lose hope in certain things. David lost hope that child would be saved, but David didn't lose trust in the Lord, and I think that's the key. There's a difference. And learning how to speak to God with trust, even in disappointment, that's something about where the book kind of leads, at least for me, because for me, the answer was no.
Yeah.
And so I had to find a way, and still have to find a way to live in relationship with God when, it would be easy for the Almighty to fix this, but for whatever reasons the Almighty has, the answer is no.
Well, and let's talk about that for a second, because we use the example of David, but it would be easy. I mean, in David's case, he could look and say, well, let's be honest, I brought this on myself.
Right.
This wasn't God betraying me. I betrayed God. This was clearly my fault. I caused all this to happen. I have no one to blame but myself.
Right.
But what about those times when it's not a result of our sin, it's not a result of our disobedience, when God, for whatever reasons, allows the circumstances of our life to turn in a direction that causes grief and sorrow. And, talk about those times, and what are some of the Psalms that can help us, like you say, restore that trust when we don't really understand what God's doing?
Right, and I think you're absolutely right about, this is not just about me and physical pain, but if we were to look out in congregations, your home church, my home church, and think about the burdens and the pain that people are carrying when they come in on a Sunday morning, I think we'd be overwhelmed by those who are raising children alone, or who have those chairs at the table that are empty. And they didn't bring that on themselves. It's just life has turned in a difficult direction. Well, some of the things that I talk about in the book is, number one, is being honest with God, very honest with God about the pain and even the disappointment. I think any kind of relationship with God has to begin with honesty. And the wonderful thing, you already know this about the Psalms, is that's exactly what God invites us to.
Yeah.
Is to honesty. And to a relationship that is more than just superficial, that we always say, isn't life always good? No, God wants more than that, invites us to more. So, one thing is honesty. Another, we see Psalms that are terribly disappointed with God, such as Psalm 89, which is a huge disappointment, or Psalm 88 and others. And what they do is they go back and they take the reader back to what God has done in the past. And I will remember the end of Psalm 77, a psalm of lament, and at the end the writer says, what am I going to do? And the answer is, I will remember the saving deeds of the Lord. Remembering what God's done in the past in order to reframe what's happening in my life now is another key element to what the Psalms do in helping us to recapture this trust and relationship. And then, frankly, some of the things that can most help people that are going through this kind of situation in their life is the help of the church. And people in the church who recognize that, for me, the time of lament and crying out for God to heal is past. And what I really need is people who will pray for me that I'll have strength to get through this day and that I'll live it faithfully. And for others, that may be, we know you are tired and worn out. We're going to come take care of your child, and you go somewhere and just relax.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's terribly important. That's not necessarily in the Psalms, but I think that's something important for the church. Models are important. And again, that's why the Psalms are important. Seeing models of people who have been able to do this, who've been able to be disappointed with God, and yet they still maintain faith. We see that with the Psalms. So I think all of those things pieced together begin to help us learn that we can live with hope that has been taken away.
Yeah.
But with trust that remains.
And I think that, and I'm going to have you. I want to have you talk about the wheel of lament, because I think it's really cool. But before you mentioned something there that that the psalmists were not afraid to express their disappointment with God, their wondering, their questions. We read some of those psalms and we think, I would never say that to God.
Right.
But here it's in his book. It's in his book, and this is their hymn book that they would sing, in worship, and and the idea that God gives us that permission. And I think, like you said, God's not afraid of our honesty. He's not afraid of our disappointment. He's not afraid of our questions. He's not afraid when Job comes and questions him about why these things are happening.
No, he wants it.
Yeah.
He wants it.
And I think I don't know that we always believe that. It's like, I can't tell God that. He'll get mad at me.
Right. Well, we think about people like the Israelites in the wilderness, and we say, well, they couldn't do that. There's a big difference between what they did in the wilderness and what the psalmists are doing.
Right.
And the difference is faith, trust. The problem in the wilderness is they didn't trust God. But that's not the problem in the Psalms. They trust God. We have faith in God. And so it makes all the difference in the world.
And that's why they're calling to him. Because they're saying, hey, God, you promised this, and it's not happening. And I know you're God, and I know you keep your promises, so here I am, and I'm staying here until you answer me, because they have that expectation that God is faithful to his word.
That's right. And who is going to call out to God in moments like that? I'm convinced it's not the person who doesn't have faith. It's the person who has faith. Who do you argue with the most? Don't answer. Don't answer. But who do you argue with the most? You argue the most with people who matter.
Yeah.
And people who don't matter, they're not worth the time, are they?
No. God
matters. And that's why we have to speak honestly.
Before we're going to run in here to the end, but I did want to get in the wheel of lament, because I think this is really cool. If you could just real briefly walk us through what you mean by the wheel of lament.
Yes, lament, when I went back to look at it to see where lament actually sends the reader, I was surprised to find that it wasn't always Thanksgiving, because that's what I always thought, that you lament and then you go to Thanksgiving. In fact, you go in several different directions, or I should say, you might go in several different directions. For example, one of the major directions is you move towards trust and confidence. Another direction is you might move towards thanksgiving. Another one, you might move towards singing new praises. And that may not be because God did what you needed, but you remember who God is. And so you continue to sing praise because of who God is. Or rejoicing in the Lord. And rejoicing is very close to praise, but that's a little bit different, where you rejoice in the Lord. And again, it may not be because you got what you wanted, but because of who God is and who you remember God to be. Or the lament may lead towards instruction, where when this is over, I'm going to be teaching other people about what's happened and what I've learned. And so lament doesn't just take us one direction. And then the last direction of the wheel of lament is the hardest one, and that's when the hope is broken. And it's gone, and it's laying over there on the other side of the yard, and it's not going to be put back together again. And so all of these directions are possible coming out of lament. And in fact, we may move in many of them. I mean, I may be praising God because of who God is, and at the same time, my hope may be totally crushed.
Yeah. And you give examples of different psalms for each one of those. It's in the book After Lament, Psalms for Learning to Trust Again. We do have a copy of Glenn's book. It is really an excellent read. If you'd like a copy, give us a call, 419-240-1937 or 1-800-457-1937. We'll take caller number 5, 419-240-1937 or 1-800-457-1937. Hey, Glenn, if folks want to find out more information about the book or about other books you may have written, how can they do so?
Yes, probably the easiest way is to go on Facebook. And on Facebook, type in the word Hurting with God, all one word, Hurting with God. I have I have my own psalms and prayers there. If you scroll down a good bit, other information about both of these books, where I might be speaking and where I might be on the radio tomorrow. So I'd be delighted if you'd visit that site.
Excellent. Hey, Glenn, thanks so much for joining us this morning. It was great talking with you. God bless.
Yes, FM.